Peter Niers has gone down in history as the boogeyman of the 16th century, and for good reason. His crimes are absolutely horrific. He spent his life traveling all over Germany, destroying everything he touched. His story is one of devil worship, dark arts, and death. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is day 2 in our countdown to Halloween, and today we're going all the way back to the 16th century, and we're talking about Peter Niers, one of the most prolific and sadistic killers in history. Peter Niers was born in Germany into a peasant family in 1540, and from a young age, Peter was very aware of his family's low social standing. He was born at a time when Germany was still reeling from the aftermath of the German Peasants' War. In 1524, a war was started between the peasants and the nobles. The lower classes were demanding more rights and freedoms, and they started a revolt, which led to a war that lasted for about a year. This war was a failure for the peasants, and they lost more than 100,000 lives during the battle, and things really only seemed to get worse after the war ended. The hierarchy became even more rigid, and if anything, they lost freedoms. What was left was a very bitter lower class, and Peter, being born into the lower class, as he grew up, he started to feel helpless about his status in the world. He thought that no matter how hard he worked, he would never move beyond the shackles of his class. Peter felt like he was a peasant, and he would remain a peasant unless he took matters into his own hands and he broke free of the system. But Peter would go about this in the most horrific way possible. He became one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers history has ever seen. So Peter embarked on this mission to break out of his class, and he did this by becoming a bandit. Bandits were a huge problem back in the 16th century. They were a constant threat to towns and villages. They would typically travel in groups, and they would just rob and murder and rape people. They were career criminals, and they were extremely dangerous. And because this is all happening in the wake of the Peasants' War, there is a lot of chaos happening in Germany at this time. In fact, between the years of 1570 and 1590, murder accounted for 15% of all crimes in Germany. The failed revolution had left behind this really messed up, hostile environment, and it was a breeding ground for criminals to just run rampant. And this was the perfect environment for a person like Peter who wanted to become a lifelong criminal. And as Peter was embarking on this journey to become a bandit, he met a man named Martin Stier. Martin Stier was a shepherd turned bandit in the years following the failed Peasants' War, and he had organized a group of 48 other shepherds, and they formed this gang of bandits. Martin's gang was responsible for the deaths of countless people across Germany. And when Martin met Peter, he saw promise. He thought that Peter had the drive, and he had a lot of hate and bitterness in his heart, and so Martin thought that he should take Peter under his wing and show him the ropes. So Martin, Peter, and Martin's gang of shepherds began traveling around together, robbing, raping, and murdering all along the way. They traveled all over Germany, just absolutely wreaking havoc everywhere they went. And Peter is taking notes because he knows that he's going to have his own gang of bandits one day, and so he's just soaking in all of these horrendous things that Martin's teaching him. And it's believed that it was during this time that Martin introduced Peter to the dark arts. Martin and his men would have ceremonies where they would attempt to summon the devil. They believed that this would give them power and supernatural abilities, and it would aid them in their crimes. And the ritual worked best if there were sacrifices. And again, Peter is soaking in all of this information, and he's taking notes from Martin. Martin Stier was eventually caught after terrorizing Germany for 22 years. He was finally apprehended. He was questioned under torture, and he confessed, and he was executed in 1572. But by the time that Martin was executed, Peter had already set off on his own. He had sufficiently trained in murder and mutilation and the dark arts, and so using everything that Martin had taught him, he gathered up some men and he started his own gang of bandits. He had about 25 members of his gang, and they traveled all across Germany, France, and Bavaria, committing the worst atrocities imaginable. They were making a name for themselves as being one of the most heartless and barbaric gangs of bandits there was. They would sometimes split up into groups so they could take on several small attacks at once, and this tactic got their death toll up very quickly. Other times they would join up together and they would take over entire towns. Peter was so confident that he would lead his men into full towns, and they would just start destroying everything and killing and raping as they pleased. Now, I have a tendency to romanticize everything, and I will do this sometimes with the past, but when I learn about stuff like this, it just reminds me of how horrible the past actually was. This is all happening in the 1500s. The plague also happened in the 1500s, killing thousands, wiping out so many communities of people. And even if you managed to survive the plague, you would still have to worry about a gang of psychopaths coming into your town and murdering you and your family. So anyways, Peter continues his life of crime for several years, but then in 1577, he and some of his men were finally caught. One of his men broke away from the gang and they went to the police and they helped police to apprehend Peter. This was back when it was still legal to use torture as a means to get a confession, and so Peter was tortured, and by the end, he had confessed to killing 75 people, mostly women. But in reality, he had probably killed a lot more than just 75 people. Peter was sentenced to death, and this should be the end of his story, but somehow he managed to escape the jail where he was being held. Did members of his gang help him escape? Was it black magic like some of the locals thought? We actually don't know how he escaped, but he did, and he went on to kill so many more people. Now, at this point, Peter Niers wasn't considered just a run-of-the-mill murdering bandit. His legend started to grow and morph into something mystical and dark. The black magic that Martin Steer had exposed him to became a point of discussion amongst the locals. Pamphlets were being distributed around the area that focused all on Niers' knowledge of the dark arts. They had heard stories of Peter cannibalizing his victims in order to obtain their power. He would kill men, women, and children and eat the flesh from their bones. He would cut the hands and feet off of infants and eat their hearts. They believed that Peter was a powerful, mystical being that could shapeshift and turn into logs and stones and various animals like cats, dogs, and goats. A man named Johann Wick released a series of pamphlets all about the life and crimes of Peter Niers and Martin Steers. In these pamphlets, Johann wrote that the bandits would summon the devil in the woods and they would skin babies and use their flesh to make candles. This was supposed to give them some sort of invisibility to make it easier for them to break into houses. Peter had become a legend. He was seen as an evil sorcerer in the eyes of the German people. They were absolutely terrified of Peter. He became known as the Boogeyman of the 16th century. Now, which of these claims are actually true and which have been exaggerated? Of course, we don't know because this happened centuries ago, but we do know that Peter was a heartless, sadistic serial killer, and thankfully, he would be arrested for a second and final time very soon. Like I said, the locals thought that Peter was a shapeshifter, and while he definitely wasn't turning into logs and stones and animals, he was really good at disguising himself. Now that he was so well known in all corners of Germany, he couldn't just travel through towns carelessly anymore. The police were still looking for him since he had escaped. So he would use various disguises. He would sometimes disguise himself as a leper. He also pretended to be a soldier, and he would use these elaborate disguises to move freely throughout Germany. But he did have a few distinguishing characteristics. First of all, he looked like an old man. He would have only been in his early 40s by this point, but apparently he looked super old for his age. He also had a scar on his chin and two very crooked fingers, and all of this really stood out. And he was known to carry around specific items with him, which included a lot of money, 2 loaded pistols, and a broadsword. And so people who came into contact with Peter Niers after he escaped prison, they noticed these things about him and they started spreading the word of what to look for if anyone ever thought they might be in the presence of Peter Niers. So by the early 1580s, a few years after he escaped prison, Peter was still on the run. He is still murdering and robbing and potentially performing black magic rituals, but he's being very careful about keeping a low profile when he goes into towns for regular activities like going into a pub or bathhouse. He would try to hide his identity. But one day in 1581, Peter let his guard down and he walked very confidently into a place called the Bells. The Bells was a lodge in the city of Neumarkt in Germany, and there were quite a few people hanging out in the lodge that day. But for whatever reason, Peter felt confident and he walked right in and he walked up to the innkeeper and he paid for a room for the night. Now, this immediately attracted the attention of some of the other patrons in the inn, and people started glancing over at Peter and they were noticing the scar on his chin, the broadsword, the crooked fingers, the very old face. And before long, a few of the patrons realized that they are probably looking at the satanic serial killing bandit Peter Niers. And eventually, pretty much everyone in this inn has become aware of who this is, and they're just like frozen in fear. Now, Peter apparently didn't notice all of the glances and the whispers, and he is just cluelessly hanging around in the inn. And eventually he walks up to the innkeeper and he hands him a handbag and he says, "Look, I'm going to go to the bathhouse for a bit. I need you to hold on to this bag until I get back." The innkeeper agrees and Peter leaves. And as soon as he's out the door, some of the other patrons tell the innkeeper, "We're pretty sure that that was Peter Niers, and you need to open that bag so that we can see what's in there and maybe we can confirm his identity." And the story goes, when they opened up the bag, they found items associated with black magic, including dried hearts in the hands of infants. They took the discovery as all the confirmation that they needed, and some of the men ran into town and rounded up more people. They tracked Peter down and they apprehended him, and he was brought to the authorities, where he was tortured until he confessed to the murder of 544 people, including 24 pregnant women. And this time, the sentence would be so much worse than the first. He was again sentenced to death, but this wouldn't be a quick hanging or beheading. Peter was tortured for 3 days. On the first day, strips of his skin were ripped from his body, and then hot oil was poured into the wounds. On the second day, his feet were roasted by covering them in oil and holding them over hot coals. But the third and final day was by far the worst. They put Peter to the breaking wheel, and if you don't know what that is, this is a picture of what it looks like. The wheel was usually wooden with an iron rim, but it could be customized to have spikes. Sometimes they were wooden spikes, sometimes they were iron spikes, just to make it more effective. Basically, a person would be taken to a stage in front of a crowd of people where they would be tied down to the ground. An executioner would drop the wheel on top of the prisoner, starting with the shins, which would then usually break their legs. The wheel would be dropped a determinate amount of time, just depending on the severity of the crime, and the executioner would work his way up the body. But they used the wheel in other ways too. Sometimes they would strap people to the wheel's rim and then push them down a hill or set them on fire. Sometimes they would be strapped across the wheel and tortured. They got very creative with the breaking wheel. Peter was assigned 42 blows from the wheel, which broke multiple bones and mutilated his body. After Peter had suffered 42 blows from the wheel, he was finally quartered by chopping off all 4 limbs, and Peter was alive when this final act took place. The story of Peter Niers is fascinating, but over the years, it's probably been embellished and exaggerated quite a bit. The only photo that comes up when you look up Peter Niers is the one that I put in the thumbnail, but that's probably not even him in the drawing. It's thought that that is actually a drawing of a court jester, which would explain the hat. That was the horrific end to the story of Peter Niers. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Consider subscribing and turning on notifications if you want to know when I upload the other videos in this series. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.